High in the northern Nepalese Himalayas, an intimidating, jagged peak looms above the surrounding mountaintops. This grand mountain is known as Manaslu. Standing at 8,156 meters, it is the 8th highest mountain in the entire world. Its uniquely steep slopes and long ridges lined by sharp cornices give the mountain an equally beautiful yet frightening appearance from afar. Manaslu was first noted by mountaineers in 1950, and several expedition teams noted a potential route up the mountain from the northeastern face, but the European expeditions did not actually make any attempt to summit it. The mountain did prove to be popular with Japanese mountaineers, however, and there were several Japanese expeditions that attempted to climb to its summit before it was successfully accomplished by Toshio Imanishi of Japan and Gyaltsen Norbu of Nepal in 1956. However, after Imanishi and Norbu summited in 1956, Manaslu would not see many climbers attempt to reach its summit for quite some time, as the next successful summit of Manaslu would be in 1971. As the expeditions from 1950 to 1956 were being attempted, the local people had gradually become quite hostile to climbers, as after a particularly bad avalanche in 1954 that destroyed a monastery and killed 18 people, the locals had begun to believe that the climbers had angered the gods. Despite this, by the 1970s, the locals began allowing mountaineers to climb the peak again without further hostilities, and while it's certainly not the most visited of the 8,000-meter peaks, Manaslu's unique climbing experience inevitably draws mountaineers to its sharp, steep slopes, with hopes of reaching its treacherous pointed peak themselves. Despite its menacing appearance, the route that mountaineers most often take to reach Manaslu's summit is fairly straightforward and offers a rather unique climbing experience amongst the other 8,000-meter Himalayan peaks. When compared to those other 8,000-meter peaks, Manaslu has historically high levels of snowfall during the Himalayan monsoon season from April to June, and thus, most descents of the mountain are attempted in the early fall once the snow has had time to settle and harden, and the extra snow accumulating on the mountain makes the ascent easier for climbers as well, as navigating the steep, rocky ridge to its summit is considerably more difficult in the spring before the ridge has been fully caked by snowfall and ice, which is subsequently lashed by the high mountain winds and forms the distinctive cornices that line the top of the mountain. So great are these cornices, in fact, that it is thought that most who reach what they believe is the summit of the mountain do not actually reach the true summit of Manaslu, as the true summit is a pointy, rocky outcropping that when fully covered with deep snow in the autumn appears to be a large unsupported cornice, and without knowing of the true summit beneath the snow beforehand, many assume that climbing any further than the foresummit appears to be borderline suicidal, although the snow is not as deep nor unstable as it appears to the eye. Aside from the final push to the summit though, Manaslu is considered to be one of the easier 8,000-meter mountains to climb, due to its relatively gentle incline and lack of high technical skill needed to reach the top when ascending the northeast face. However, despite this reputation, when compared to the other easier 8,000-meter peaks such as Cho Oyu, Manaslu has significantly higher fatality rates. While the route up Manaslu is not particularly steep, the ascent up the glacier is riddled with large, gaping crevasse fields, a particularly active ice fall between camps 1 and 2, and large looming seracs lining its upper ridges. Along with these dangers, due to high annual snowfall on the mountain combined with typically warmer weather than other 8,000-meter peaks, avalanches are a constant threat to mountaineers, and climbers that hope to summit Manaslu must maintain constant vigilance regarding the snow conditions at all times, lest they be swept away by a mighty Himalayan avalanche. In September of 2012, the climbing season on Manaslu was in full swing. The teams of climbers began to arrive at base camp and had begun to set up their ropes and climb to higher camps, acclimatizing as they went, as is typical for any 8,000-meter climb. The conditions in 2012 were rather poor to start. There had been many days of snowfall before an opportune 10-day weather window opened up around September 15th. This year, Camp 3 had been set at a location lower than usual, as this lower Camp 3 was sheltered from the wind by a large serac field above it, as the typical Camp 3 site sat about 100 meters further up the mountain, but was much more exposed to the high winds that constantly lashed against the mountain. This favorable weather window was again brought to a halt by the evening of September 22, 2012, as a fierce blizzard engulfed Manaslu. The climbers that had been hoping to reach the summit within the next few days hunkered down in their tents for the night, hoping to get some rest and that the storm system would ease up by dawn. At 4:30 a.m. on September 23rd, as most of the climbers on the mountain were soundly slumbering, a huge serac, estimated to be approximately 600 meters wide, broke off from above Camp 3, creating a monstrous avalanche that quickly gathered speed, accelerated by the added mass of the huge serac. The avalanche tore through Camp 3, uprooting the climbers' tents, and swept away the 31 people at Camp 3 in its torrent of moving snow. A professional skier named Glenn Blake, who was attempting to reach the summit without oxygen and then ski back down, recalled that he was doing some reading in his tent as his tent mate, a man named Gregory Costa, slept in his sleeping bag next to him. Suddenly, their tent was flung into the air by the wall of moving snow, and Costa was catapulted from the tent. He was never seen again. After feeling a huge surge of air from the avalanche lift their tents up off the ground, many of the climbers at Camp 2 knew that the avalanche was likely over by this point and peeked their heads out of their tents and up the slopes towards Camp 3. Another professional skier, a Canadian man named Greg Hill, recalled that he saw headlamps scattered along the mountain above him, and at first assumed that it was some climbers doing a bit of early morning acclimatization climbing, but quickly realized that Camp 3 was no longer visible, and it was then that he knew that the avalanche had swept away Camp 3. Hill and the other climbers at Camp 2 rushed up the mountain to aid in rescuing the climbers from Camp 3, and by the morning, helicopters were dispatched, and a full-blown search for survivors had gotten underway. Of the 31 people that had been swept away by the avalanche at Camp 3, by the end of the 23rd, 8 had been confirmed dead, and 3 were still missing. As the days passed, the fate of the 3 missing had been all but sealed. In the aftermath of the incident, many of the remaining mountaineers abandoned their climbs, while some pressed on to the summit. A Frenchman and the guide for Glenn Blake's team named Remy Lecluse was one of the missing men, and his wife heartbreakingly searched for him on the glacier, as a large funeral was held for him and several other French climbers back in Chamonix, France. He was later found deceased in a crevasse, having been swept there by the avalanche. Ultimately, 11 people were killed in the incident. This tragedy, however, would raise awareness about the dangers of Manasla's slopes and the dangers of the herd mentality while climbing, as several small independent teams had abandoned their climbs just days before, concerned about a potential avalanche. But as the larger commercially led teams began to ascend the mountain, the other larger commercial teams felt pressured to get their clients to the top of the mountain as well. The mentality of, they did it so it's probably safe, had been festering within many of the more recent expeditions to Manaslu, with several climbers noting that many guides were unclipped from the ropes while crossing the crevasse fields, and so the clients too mostly crossed the crevasse fields unclipped as well. This herd mentality had permeated the psyche of even more experienced climbers, and while extremely unfortunate, the avalanche in 2012 served as a much-needed wake-up call to many of the expedition companies that overlooking potential safety concerns can have extremely deadly consequences. And in the decade since this tragedy, there have been no further fatalities caused by avalanches on Manaslu. Thank you all for watching.